Estimates, based on tables compiled by third parties, put the final, officially released 3DO software number at approximately 200 titles, though further investigation raises the figure to around 340 when including unreleased games. Of these, several were exclusive to Japan. Taiketsu Rooms, exclusive to the system in Mercenary. Ports from other systems, Samurai Showdown, while others were edutainment or strictly adults only, Plumbers Don't Wear Ties. In the case of many FMV games, they were often superior to their counterparts on other hardware, such as Psychic Detective. Along with the initial high price, people agreed that it was lack of enough decent games and popular icons that killed the 3DO. Despite some valiant attempts, and there were many gems, most games could be found elsewhere or came out too late and with too little marketing to save it in light of the twin juggernauts Sega and Sony. Trip believes it was more than just cost. Personally, I think too much is made of the initial price. In my view, bigger problems were the lack of good software at launch and that we had locked into low license fees and could not subsidise lower pricing or do much real marketing. Key titles from EA, like Road Rash, were as much as a year late coming to the market, but then it was too late. The swath of rubbish games and porn that adorned the system in its later years also didn't help, neither did the lack of piracy protection help. CDs were easy to replicate using regular civilian burners, and these copies ran on standard unmodified machines. Also, far too few of Japan's mostly excellent games made it to the West. The amount of 3DO titles only released in Japan is staggering. Titles such as the brawler Yu Yu Hakusho, the Alone in the Dark inspired Dr. Horza, Kojima's epic space adventure Policenauts, Street Racer Autobahn Tokyo, and simultaneous 4-player game Taiketsu Rooms still remain unknown to most Westerners. This is an important anomaly, since while other American systems such as the Jaguar, Xbox and 360 have all failed in Japan, the 3DO had some degree of success. It was manufactured by several Asian companies, not just Japan, but also South Korea and Singapore, who licensed the technology, believing it to be profitable. Hawkins explains, "Our manufacturing partners were global companies and both we and they had global aspirations. Hardware partners included Matsushita, Sanyo, LG, Samsung, Creative Labs and Toshiba. Some of the more interesting peripherals and merchandise were only released in Japan. While instead of looking at the system with disdain like they do Microsoft's machines, Japanese developers created several excellent games, though few were licensed. Kenji Ino's Warp was a 3DO stalwart, releasing titles like D, blob-based puzzler Purapon Kun, and the bizarre Russian Fire Megadas, which seems to be compromised of Warp-based interactive TV channels. Another developer deserving mention is RPG-loving Microcabin. They weren't up with Square, but for the system starved of good RPGs, they were a godsend. Happily, 2 of their RPGs made it to the West, Lucian's Quest and the tactics-based Guardian War. Oddly, many Western games were localized in Japan, even if they weren't suitable. Star Control 2, which contains several hours of English dialogue, had its text and voiceovers redone in Japanese. For a game built around communicating with strangely voiced alien races, to have all of them translated into Japanese is a surprise. More surprisingly, they did a good job, making the game a collector's piece. But why did Japan support Trip Hawkins' dream so strongly? The reasons were likely twofold. First was price. It was cheap to develop for, and it was cheaper to acquire a license for than other hardware. Japanese business is polarized. There's the big players like Sony and Matsushita, and then the more experimental little guys like Microcabin and Warp. The 3DO represented to the little guys an opportunity to cheaply develop games on CD for the latest 32-bit hardware. It was a great way to experiment safely with the new medium and technology. In preparation for later developing on Saturn and PS1, an entry for many into the next generation. While their early 3DO efforts may have been rough around the edges, the experience gained would be invaluable later on. The second reason was that Japanese companies were manufacturing the system, tailoring it slightly, which helped immensely with gaining some degree of public acceptance. The 3DO had ideals and Japanese involvement. Conversely, the Xbox is unmistakably American and far from idealistic. It's not that Japan is anti-American, rather that they're pro-Japanese. When Matsushita was the first manufacturer of the machine, inevitably, the Japanese must have taken notice and assumed it to have merit. Trip announced the M2 follow-up in 1995, but 3DOs stopped being sold sometime in 1996, forcing many planned developments to remain unreleased. The big one is that we built one of the first truly interactive broadband TV networks with Time Warner and US West, which used a special 3DO model as the TV set-top box. It was built and deployed in a trial, but never commercialised. The M2 was completed but never released, and no examination of the 3DO legacy could be comprehensive without looking at the M2. Wishing to pull out the hardware market, Trip Hawkins sold the next generation M2 technology to Matsushita, original licensor and debut 3DO supplier. The price was a cool $100 million, which recouped all the costs from Hawkins' initial 3DO venture. Legend has it that the person behind the deal was demoted from a high position at Matsushita, then relocated to and put in charge of a fish cannery far south of Japan. The M2 looks ready for launch, much to the anticipation of gamers. Some games are alleged to have been finished, most notably by the eccentric band of Mavericks at Warp. Rumour has it they even created a vastly different version of D2 for the machine. Tech specs and screens of these apparent titles showed the system to be far more powerful than the PS1, making it seem ready to conquer the market. The project was shelved though. Trip Hawkins gives some fascinating insight into why. The reality is that while Matsushita won the VCR war with Sony and acquired Universal Studios and seemed as media savvy as Sony, in truth, Sony thinks like a digital media company and Matsushita thinks like a hardware manufacturer. Once Sony waded in with guns blazing, Matsushita got the deer in the headlights look and they just froze and didn't want to get into a battle with Sony. Sony committed and spent about $2 billion to force PlayStation to get off the ground, and neither 3DO or its partners ever had even 10% of that budget or appetite. Regardless, 3DO's successor still entered the public arena in various guises. The full story warrants more analysis, but let us recap briefly. M2 hardware made it into crippled media players, which were apparently used for car presentations by Chevrolet and Chrysler, and also a 3D house building system for room planning. But more unusually, it also made it into the Japanese coffee vending machines and Russian ATMs. So enamoured is the underground hardcore collective that there's been jovial banter of trying to smuggle said vending machines and ATMs across the border in order to acquire an actual working system. Finally, it was also used to create games for arcades, though only Konami seemed to develop anything. Some of their titles include Polystars and zombie-themed blaster Evil Knight. Proper M2 systems, both development and prototype, are a little more rare. In mid-2005, there was the discovery of a prototype system bought for $20 at North Carolina flea market by Stephen Flynn. Once the furor had passed, the machine was then sold to Thomas Riemer in Germany for $2,500. Mr. Riemer informs that there has only been one other M2 discovered in a similar, though not quite as finished state, which sold for a comparable amount. The operating system menus for these machines point to something interesting. The system was to have a final controller design nearly identical to that of the N64's. 3DO, the company continued, dealing only in software, before finally filling for Chapter 11 in 2003 and putting an end to the name and legacy. In the beginning, everyone had been optimistic, but the reasons for the collapse were complex. 3DO was the first high-tech company to go public without a real operating business, preceding the dot-com bubble. The irony of this is that by going public and achieving a market value greater than $1 billion, 3DO first lost its strategic partners because they had a hugely profitable exit, and then 3DO failed because its access to capital dried up. Many people think of an IPO as a victory, but for the 3DO, it was a death sentence.